Okay, so good morning, everyone. We are here at the Pontificia Universidad Javeriana. We're having talks by Quill, Kukla, and José Medina. We are very pleased of having them here celebrating the 50th anniversary of the doctorate program in philosophy. And I'm gonna introduce both of them to the talks. So Professor Quill Kukla es profesor titular de la Universidad de Georgetown, es investigador senior del Kennedy Institute of Ethics, actualmente es Humboldt Research Scholar en la Leibniz University en Hannover. Entre sus intereses de investigación están los problemas éticos y sociales de la producción y comunicación del conocimiento científico, la ética reproductiva y la cultura del embarazo y de la maternidad, la ética de la salud pública y de la comunicación del conocimiento médico, la ética de la investigación y los problemas metodológicos y epistemológicos de la medicina. Profesor Kukla es autor de Yo and Low, The Pragmatic Topography of the Space of Reasons, en coautoría con Mark Lance, y de numerosos artículos en revistas como Hypatia, Ethics y Philosophy and Phenomenological Research, entre otros. Entre sus proyectos actuales se encuentran la naturaleza del consentimiento y la agencia sexual, la ética y la epistemología de la representación de datos espaciales y del conocimiento geográfico, la fuerza pragmática de inclusión y exclusión que tiene el discurso público, y la naturaleza y el uso de las categorías de la enfermedad. So I'm going to make this introduction in English now. Dr. Quill Kukla is professor of philosophy at Georgetown University and senior research scholar at the Kennedy Institute of Ethics. They are also Humboldt Research Scholar at Leibniz University in Hanover. Dr. Kukla's research interests within practical ethics include the ethical and social complexities of scientific knowledge production and communication, reproductive ethics and the culture of pregnancy and motherhood, public health ethics, the ethics of health communication, research ethics, methodological issues in medical research, and the social epistemology of medicine. Dr. Kukla is author, along with Mark Lance, of Yo and Low, The Pragmatic Topography of the Space of Reasons, and of a number of journals, of articles in journals such as Hypatia, Ethics, and Philosophy and Phenomenological Research. Their current projects concern sexual consent and sexual agency, the ethics and epistemology of spatial data representations, and geographic knowledge. One project on the pragmatic force of inclusionary and exclusionary public speech and signage, and one on the nature and social use of disease categories. El profesor José Medina es Walter Scott Professor of Philosophy en la Northwestern University. Sus intereses de investigación incluyen la teoría crítica de la raza, la teoría queer, la filosofía del lenguaje, la filosofía de la mente, la filosofía política y la epistemología social. Entre sus publicaciones más reconocidas están The Epistemology of Resistance, Gender and Racial Oppression, Epistemic Injustice and Resistant Imaginations, publicado en el 2013. Speaking from Elsewhere, a new contextualist perspective on meaning, identity and discursive agency, publicado en 2006. Sus proyectos más recientes exploran la manera en que la percepción y la imaginación social contribuyen a la formación de vulnerabilidades y a diferentes formas de violencia y opresión. Entre esos proyectos está el de las formas en que los movimientos sociales y los diferentes tipos de activismo pueden ser movilizados para resistir la violencia y la opresión sexual y racial en contextos locales y globales. Professor Medina is Walter Scott Professor of Philosophy at Northwestern University. Professor Medina works primarily in critical race theory, feminist and queer theory, political philosophy, communication theory, and epistemology. His books include The Epistemology of Resistance, Gender and Racial Oppression, Epistemic Injustice and Resistant Imaginations, and Speaking from Elsewhere. His most recent co-edited volumes are The Handbook of Epistemic Injustice and Cosmopolitanism and Place. His current projects focus on how social perception and the social imagination contribute to the formation of vulnerabilities to different kinds of violence and oppression. These projects also explore the social movements and kinds of activism that can be mobilized to resist racial and sexual violence and oppression in local and global contexts. We're very happy of having Quill and Jose taking part of the celebration of the 50th year anniversary of our doctorate program in philosophy. On behalf of the Faculty of Philosophy at Universidad Javeriana, I thank you again for accepting our invitation. At the end of both talks, we'll have a brief exchange between Quill and Jose, where they will discuss the claims that they made in their talks. After that, we'll have a round of Q&As. Members of the public can participate by raising their virtual hands. You can ask your questions directly, or you can write them in the chat in English or in Spanish. So without further ado, I give you Quill Kukla.
Thank you. Let me share my screen. Just give me a moment. Does that look good? Everyone can see? Excellent. Okay. So the idea that the city should be for everyone and made by everyone is often known as the right to the city. I'm going to start by exploring this idea of the right to the city, and then I'm going to think about how cities are marked by spatial injustice. That is, our unequal access to and control over city space. I'm going to look at what sorts of spaces we need to have available to us in order to enjoy the right to the city. And finally, I'm going to explore what's involved in building cities that give all their residents the right to the city. But first, I need to start with this notion of the right to the city. So the right to the city as a phrase has no settled, precise meaning, and it's used differently by different theorists. I find the concept most helpful when it's taken as having several components. So first of all, the right to the city, as I'm using the phrase, is the right to inhabit urban space. Inhabiting urban space requires having a place to live in that space and the means to survive in it, but it's something stronger than that. It also involves being able to live one's life and pursue one's projects in that space. And this requires that we have what I call spatial agency, which isn't just a matter of being able to perch there in the city, but being able to act and be self-determining within and upon city spaces. Second, inhabiting space involves altering and tinkering with space and reworking it in order to meet our needs. So living in a space that's unaccommodating or inflexible isn't really inhabiting it, it's just being contained in it. So the right to the city then includes the right to live in a space that suits us and that we can help shape to our needs so that it supports our agency and allows us to be at home in it. While all urban dwellers should have the opportunity to have a voice in collective decision-making about their city, the lived right to the city is often going to be much more local than this. It's going to be about working on and shaping the smaller territories that we live in. Third, while most urban dwellers have private homes, though not all of them, of course, distinctively, urban life is life that happens in shared spaces. In general, suburban shared spaces like roads and supermarkets are designed to support private family spaces. But in the city, the dependence tends to be reversed. Private spaces are much smaller, and they're built around the expectation that their inhabitants will be out in shared public spaces. Even wealthy city dwellers typically live close up to other people, often in the same building. And private homes in cities tend to be more porous, with shared walls and ceilings and more people in smaller spaces. Urban porches and balconies and alleys often serve as interesting points of contact with where shared and private life spill over into one another. City dwellers are constantly, as a matter of course, accommodating themselves to one another. Living one's life with these kinds of negotiations makes for a distinctive kind of embodied existence. And so we can say that the right to the city is a right to inhabit shared space. Fourth, Henri Lefebvre, who introduced the phrase the right to the city, insisted that the right to the city is always a concrete material achievement. It's a matter of building spaces that are habitable in the fullest sense of the term for everyone. So the right to the city has to be physically built. It's not something we can just legislate into existence through policy. And finally, none of us, and this is going to be a really important point for me throughout this talk, none of us will be equally at home in every part of the city. Cities are territorialized. The right to the city never realistically means that the whole city is our territory. It requires that we have access to a wide variety of different kinds of territories that support different dimensions of our agency and our identity. So the right to the city, as I understand it, involves the right of city dwellers to be at home and have agency in a range of different kinds of territories, but not necessarily in the whole city. So based on this multi-part understanding of the right of the city, in this paper, I'm going to explore several intertwined questions. First of all, how are people unequally situated to enjoy a right to the city? How do they have unequal spatial agency or an unequal ability to inhabit the shared spaces of the city? Second, how are the concepts of public space and private space useful or not useful for theorizing these shared spaces? Are all of our important shared spaces public spaces? And if not, what sorts of other shared spaces are important to us? And then finally, how can we build the right kind of city spaces which will let dwellers of all sorts flourish and enjoy spatial agency together in shared space? Or in other words, how do we build the right to the city? Okay, so starting with this question of being unequally situated within the city. Urban spaces are shared, but that doesn't mean they're shared equally, or that they're shared with everyone, or that everyone's agency is equally supported within them. In fact, there are probably no completely universally accessible urban spaces. I'm interested in how the kind of material body that we have shapes our relationship to space and inflects our right to the city. There's never any such thing as the unmarked general way that a space is available to be used. Different bodies will always fit into and experience space differently and will have different possibilities for agency within a space. All kinds of things determine who can access and participate in a supposedly shared space, from the shape and distribution of benches to how an area is policed, to the norms around graffiti and street art, to laws surrounding protests and squatting and loitering, just for example. The color of our skin and our perceived gender identity and our perceived class, regardless of our actual economic situation, all affect how we can move through and use space. So just a few examples. Young Black men in the United States experience extreme spatial restriction. If they're standing together in a public area, they're at risk of being questioned or worse by the police, or at a minimum, they suffer suspicious surveillance from other passersby. Another example, people whose bodies are read as female are trained from a young age to avoid streets at night, to travel in groups, and to adopt defensive and self-isolating bodily postures in order to avoid getting sexual attention from men. This training not only shapes their bodily movement through space, but it prevents all kinds of social interactions of the kind that make up city living. Women can't risk minor friendly passing interactions with men often for fear that these will escalate. Third example, someone who presents as poor or as unrespectable in their appearance is going to be questioned or followed if they try to enter an office or a hotel lobby or a restaurant that's supposedly for everyone, but is in fact marked as territory for the economic elite. Now, these points might seem obvious, but it's important to note how profoundly bodily differences shape who can use which spaces in which ways, and which bodies are allowed to claim territory and where. Features of space that may seem on the surface as if they affect all users the same way, in fact interact differently with different bodies and enable or undermine spatial agency differently. So for example, the presence of video surveillance cameras or police in space differentially affects people's ability to use and tinker with a space. People whose bodies are socially marked as suspicious or open to harassment are going to be affected differently by the presence of these technologies or these people. Or a really important example, what we call hostile architecture, which is architecture that's specifically designed to keep people from staying in a space. For example, I have a photograph here on this slide of a bench that is designed so that you can't lie down on it or be comfortable on it. This kind of architecture affects homeless people, disabled people, and elderly people, and anyone who needs to rest differentially. There's tons of empirical evidence that shows that our perceptions of risk and safety, order and disorder are inflected by race and class. And part of how we become skilled at coping with the embodied complexity of city life is by developing salience responses. And these aren't innocent. They encode race and otherwise socially biased expectations. So we learn to see a situation as disorderly and threatening, or something we need to react to or avoid, or as orderly and safe and something we can ignore. And these perceptions are structured by bias. So for example, what is seen as socializing when one group of people does it is going to be seen as loitering when another group of people does it, depending on age, race, and apparent economic status. And if there are anti-loitering laws in place, this is going to directly impact how the two different groups can use space. Some people's marking of space through street art, to give another example, is going to be seen as charming and making the neighborhood quirky, whereas when other people do it, it's going to be seen as defacement that causes risky disorder. So the fact that bodies are seen differently in social space also has concrete effects on how people can use the space. In cases like those, there's no separate objective truth of the matter that we can appeal to. So the difference between socializing and loitering, or between adding character and defacing, isn't a difference that exists in the practice. It's a difference in how the practice receives social uptake. And this social uptake is dependent on the bodies and the identities of the actors and the perceivers. A couple of major ways or axes along which people are excluded from space. Consider age. Age is a major axis that helps shape spatial agency and access. Not only are plenty of spaces explicitly restricted by age, but we've created culture, widespread, not just in the United States, but in almost everywhere I've gone, a culture in which adolescents really have little to no comfortable space to use. Almost anywhere that they congregate, they're seen as a disruption and a threat. And this results not only in surveillance and resentment from those around them, but also in the real risk of harassment and removal from public spaces by authorities. Conversely, elderly people are often uncomfortable in spaces that are marketed to the young, like clubs or bars. And the one I'm going to focus on most, among the most vivid ways in which bodies are differentially included in spaces, is via their capacities or their abilities. So most obviously, spaces might be inaccessible to wheelchair users or those with limited mobility, but there are all sorts of less obvious ways in which spaces can include or exclude those with different capacities. Deaf people need to be able to see one another to converse, so their ability to use spaces with narrow, single file only walking areas for normal kinds of interactions is curtailed. Noisy or chaotic areas might be unusable for people with sensory processing disorders. Theaters with small seats or hotels or hospitals with narrow beds might be unusable by large people. To put the point more generally, this is a wonderful quote that I love. Susan Wendell argues, "The public world is the world of strength, performance, and production. We have built spaces around the idea that normal bodies can lift things, move quickly, and be available anytime for production. Public space has been structured as though no one of any importance in the public world has to breastfeed a baby or look after a sick child. Much of the public world is also structured as though everyone were physically strong, as though all bodies were shaped the same, as though everyone could walk, hear, and see well, as though everyone could work and play at a pace that is not compatible with any kind of illness or pain, as though no one were ever dizzy or incontinent or simply needed to sit or lie down. For instance, where could you rest for a few minutes in a supermarket if you needed to?" Now, these assumptions of normal ability and productivity are built into the material form of our spaces and into our embodied norms for how to use them. We treat the accommodation of other sorts of bodies as a compromise in the quality of our productive spaces. Wendell points out that normal bodies receive an enormous amount of material support from the spaces that they inhabit. They get public transportation systems, recreational facilities. Ooh, there's a funny scratch on my screen and I don't know what it is. Okay, I'm just going to ignore it. Sorry, I don't know what that is. I didn't touch my screen. Public transportation systems, recreation facilities for staying fit and relaxing, doors and escalators that suit their arm strength and their body pace, and so forth. Think about how escalators are specifically paced for certain kinds of bodies. While normal bodies might appear to be independent, this is only because this huge material network of support is invisible and taken for granted. But we are poor at designing spaces that accommodate a wider range of bodies. We see doing so as offering special support for suboptimal bodies rather than just different support for different bodies. My thing is being weird, sorry. Okay, yeah, that scratch is still there. I don't know what that is. I apologize for the scratch. And I want to focus on one dimension of bodily difference of this sort. So one fascinating dimension along which bodies are included or excluded in space is pace. Wendell explores pace differences as a socially powerful form of body diversity and pace bias as a pervasive form of ableism. She points out that we're trained up to value speed of work and motion, and we treat those who move or produce at a slower pace as less valuable rather than simply temporally different. And I have to admit, recognizing pace bias in myself when I first read her book was a major revelation for me. I had tried to critically reflect on my own racism and sexism and fat phobia and other forms of bigotry, and it had never occurred to me that my own pride in my fast pace and my frustration with those who moved or talked slowly was a form of ableist bigotry of its own. But the quality and value of what someone does isn't connected in any obvious way to how fast they do it. It's an internalized piece of insidious capitalist ideology to think that those who are slower paced are less valuable because they're less productive. Now, here's the point, getting back to space. City spaces have an entrenched pace. Places are structured by what David Seaman calls place ballets, bodily habits and routines that are intertwined with their environments. People move in distinctive ways in train stations, grocery stores, and schoolyards, and these movements are shaped by and give meaning to the physical structure of these spaces. Just imagine how weird it would look if you moved your body the way that you're supposed to move it in a grocery store while you're standing in a train station or vice versa. Our bodily motions are key to the spaces that we're in. Place ballets have a rhythm and a pace to them. And this pace, although it's culturally variable, usually develops around the built-in assumption that these spaces are for traditional productive bodies and that faster is better. If someone can't keep up with the pace of the space around them, then this is going to put them out of sync with that space and make it less usable for them. The mismatch between the pace of a person and the pace of a space that they might negotiate can literally make disability, even in someone who would not be disabled in a slower paced space. We can see this regularly in busy city spaces. And to some extent, this kind of exclusion is no one's fault. City spaces develop a pace through slow sedimentation, and it's not like we can plausibly expect everyone to slow down to match the pace of somebody who's slower than normal. The problem is that a slower pace isn't just a difference that causes spatial mismatch, it's disvalued. Spaces don't just city spaces don't just happen to be fast-paced. This fast pace is valued as integral to productivity. And because speed is valued by most users of city spaces, the pace of the place ballets is maximized. And as the pace of a space increases, a larger number of people can't keep up, and more people end up disabled by their material context. So capitalist ideology produces disability through the material environments that it creates, as well as a built-in lack of interest in accommodating this kind of disability. We could, with some adjustments, remake spaces to accommodate a wider range of paces without directly altering people's normal pace. So just to give one example, on most university campuses, there are 10 minutes between classes because the assumption is that this is how long it takes a normal student to hurry from one class to another. And this directly shuts slower paced students out of many classes. If we increase the time between classes to 20 minutes, even if this is more time than most people strictly need, we would literally reduce disability on campus. Now, it seems to me that it's impossible that all spaces can be designed to accommodate all bodies. I'm going to keep coming back to that point. Some spaces are fast-paced by their essential nature. The floor of the New York Stock Exchange, for instance. Some spaces are going to be too noisy and busy for those with sensory processing challenges, and some spaces are going to be designed around their visual appearance and are not going to be meaningful to blind people. So as I'm going to keep coming back to in this talk, it's important to remember that no one is going to be at home in all parts of the city. Flourishing cities are just too diverse for this. Supporting every city dweller's right to the city does not mean giving everyone access to an agency within every part of the city, but rather making sure as best we can that everyone has this within a wide range of spaces sufficient to support a flourishing urban life. But we need to recognize that right now, access to spaces is not just differentiated, but unequal, in the sense that privileged city dwellers have more and better access to a wider range of spaces and more agency within those spaces. And we need to be aware of how spatial injustice and more general patterns of inequality mutually support and amplify one another. And we should try to combat that by making spaces more inclusive where and when we can. Spatial justice requires that we work to make sure everyone with every kind of body be able to participate fully in urban life. But what that means is that we need to do some careful thinking about who spaces are built by and for and who they accommodate. But we also need to think about what different kinds of spaces people actually need in order to have a rich and full urban life. Since I've said they're not going to have access to the whole city, what sorts of territories do people need in order to really flourish in the city and enjoy a right to the city? And that's what I'm going to spend the rest of my talk on. Now, lots of theorists of the right to the city have assumed that building public spaces is the key. And I think that that's too simple. So I'm going to spend some time talking about public space and what it is and what its limitations are. In this section of the paper, I'm going to talk about the variety of public spaces. And in the next section, I'm going to introduce a kind of shared space that is important to flourishing life, but isn't well categorized by any public-private distinction. Now, it turns out that there's no conceptual unity to the notion of public space. The public space, in its contrast with private space, can mean a dizzying array of different things. And here's a list, which is surely a non-exhaustive list. So one thing we might mean is that public space is space that is for the activities that make up the public sphere: protests, deliberative democracy, assemblies, markets, and so forth. In contrast to private space, which is the space of intimacy and domesticity. Secondly, you can think of public space as a contact zone, a space for passing encounters and the mingling of the residents of a city. Public spaces, in Jane Jacobs' language, are spaces of unplanned encounters. In contrast, private spaces are controlled and restricted and tend to be relatively predictable and homogeneous. Third, this is a common meaning of public space. You might think of public space as space that is owned collectively or by the state, or as unowned space, whereas in contrast, private space is commodified and controlled by its owners and can be bought or sold on the market. Fourth, public space, and this is the most common one in everyday language, even though philosophers don't talk about it very much. Public space can be space in which users are in public. That is, they're not hidden and they have no expectation of privacy. So here in public space, one is on display. Private spaces, in contrast, were shielded from the public eye. Fourth, Henri Lefebvre talks about public spaces, fifth, he talks about public spaces as spectacular or theatrical spaces. These are spaces in which our social identities are performed for the public. And public space in this sense is an arena in which our public identities get negotiated. Sixth, public space can be space that is not territorialized. It's a space that's for everyone, rather than having insiders and outsiders the way private space does. 7, public spaces can be spaces that are collectively shaped. spaces where diverse citizens can all participate in using and transforming space. Private spaces, in contrast, are those that limit and control who has agency in them and restrict it just to the owners of the space. And finally, public space might be formally inclusive space. That is, as a matter of policy, space where anyone is allowed to be there. This doesn't say what they're allowed to do there, or how much agency they have there, or how at home they're going to feel there. But on this conception, a space is public if it doesn't formally bar anyone from entering it. And I want to claim all of these are live senses of public space, and there's nothing that unifies them. And in fact, they yield directly conflicting verdicts on whether various kinds of spaces are public. So think about a market, for example. A market is a public space according to my first and second definitions, but it's usually private according to my third definition. Or think about a square that's used by an authoritarian government for orchestrated national celebrations and assemblies. This is a paradigmatic example of a public space according to definitions 3, 4, 5, and maybe 8, but it fails to meet the definitions of publicity in 2 and in 7, which we might think are more essential to the right to the city. Now, lots of theorists, as I mentioned, treat building public space as the key to ensuring a universal right to the city. But different kinds of public space really differ in terms of how inclusive and flexible they are. A space might be public in that it's a space for spectacle, or because it's owned collectively, or in not having any formal restrictions on who can enter. But at the same time, it could be deeply exclusionary or have extremely rigid rules for its use. It might be inaccessible to people with certain disabilities, or it might be heavily policed in ways that differentially impact teenagers or racial minorities. There's nothing about most of these forms of public space that ensures broad inclusivity or spatial agency. In particular, there are legitimate intuitive senses of public space in which public spaces can be used by governments to control people's behavior and identity, top down. Soviet cities were known for their extensive and heavy-handed top-down use of public space. Public spaces under communism were not spaces of inclusive agency and placemaking. They were spaces where shared civic and national identity were staged and spectacularized, and movement and spatial use were tightly controlled. Indeed, some highly orchestrated public spaces are specifically designed to control citizens top-down by way of their publicity, by staging things like assemblies and controlling the gaze and the attention of users. Consider the National Mall in Washington, D.C., which is the official space for assembly and protest for Americans. And I assume almost everyone has seen images that look like this. The space is designed to display and inculcate respect for state power, with the Capitol building on one end and the monuments to past presidents at the other. It's lined with monumental architecture, which tells a specific narrative about power and American identity. What I want you to notice looking at these pictures is that the shape and size and path of any protest is directly controlled by the shape of the space and its entry and exit points. It's heavily surveyed and securitized, and its users need permits to protest here. So while it's hosted many of the world's most influential protests, these are regulated, controlled, and monitored by the state, and the state has final say over which ones occur. It's visually impossible to forget when you protest here that it's also the site of presidential inaugurations and displays of national power. So it would be very misleading to think of the National Mall as a site of enhanced inclusive spatial agency. It's rather a site, first and foremost, where American identities get produced and controlled and monitored and displayed. Protest spaces like this one are highly choreographed, with the spaces themselves controlling the flow and shape and pace and form of any protests that happen there. The place ballets that the space allows and supports are tightly constrained. And I think this is, for those who followed the news of the January 6th protests where the Capitol building was stormed, I think this is part of why Americans found those protests so shocking and why they seem to represent a real collapse of government control, is because they breached that choreography. They did not stick to the state-controlled choreography of protest. So these kinds of official protest spaces are securitized, choreographed, bounded, and surveyed. And while one might use them to communicate a semantic message of protest, it's very difficult to use them to cause actual spatial disruption. This is why the Occupy Wall Street movement, which was also just known as the Occupy movement after a while, of the early 2010s was so powerful, even though it was mocked for not having a focused and unified semantic message. It genuinely repurposed space for the ends of protest. Protesters entered space that was not their territory and used it for ends other than those for which it was designed, rather than sticking to designated protest spaces. They inhabited space in resistant ways that were not controlled top-down. And I'd like to suggest that a flourishing city that supports spatial agency and the right to the city has to be resilient enough to make room for its own genuine disruption of this sort. Okay. Now I want to go past public spaces and talk about another kind of space. And I can already tell I'm going to run out of time, so I'm going to cut my last section, which means I'm going to end a little bit abruptly, but that's okay. I'm going to get to the parts that are important to me. Back when I was a teenager, part of that demographic that, as I mentioned, is treated as unwelcome in most kinds of space. My friends and I gathered every weekend and after school every day on the platform of the Eglinton subway station in Toronto. The space was not elaborate. Like all subway platforms, it had quite a bit of open space and it had good sight lines. And there was a small bodega on the platform that sold snacks. We weren't exactly welcome there, but there were enough of us and our presence was sufficiently entrenched that the platform felt like our territory, despite the hostile or intimidated looks that adults sometimes gave us. Every once in a while, transit security would try to chase us away, but there were too many of us and we were too regular. And crucially, we weren't actually trespassing in a private space, so we were hard to get rid of. If you didn't know what you wanted to do for the evening, you could go to the platform and hang out until you heard about a party or ran into enough friends to make a plan. Once you made a plan, you could just hop on the subway and go where you wanted. But you could also just hang out on the platform itself for hours, gossiping, passing on information, complaining, flirting, tagging the walls, making out, making noise, smoking, sometimes buying or selling weed. It was a place where we could just be together, our place, and it didn't matter that it was kind of dirty and lit by fluorescent lights. The Eglinton subway platform was for us what Ray Oldenburg in 1989 termed a third place, a place that was neither our home nor our place of business, but that was ours in a communal sense, a space for socializing, playing, and just existing together in a fluid and unstructured but patterned way. Gretchen McCulloch describes third places as, quote, social centers distinguished by an emphasis on conversation and playfulness. They have regular attendees who set the tone for newcomers, the freedom to come and go as you please, and a lack of formal membership requirements. Now, most geographic analyses of cities focus almost exclusively on residences and on workplaces, as if these are the two locations that most essentially define where people belong. But Oldenburg, in introducing the concept of third places, suggested that a full and flourishing city life requires belonging in such third places as well. Third places can include barbershops, coffee shops, bars, sidewalks, vacant lots, gyms, parks. Sometimes a space is designed and marketed to be a third place, like a coffee shop or a bar. But sometimes, as in my subway platform story, these spaces emerge organically as users establish their place ballets, even though they were never designed to have a place identity at all. Now, third places have to be territorialized in order to serve their central function of feeling like our place. They don't formally police their boundaries and they have no strict inclusion criteria. But like all territorialized spaces, insiders have special abilities to negotiate them competently and to experience themselves as included. Are third places public spaces or private spaces? The question seems to miss the point of their character to me. They are insider territories that belong neither to the domestic realm nor to the realm of work. Sometimes they're state-owned, like a park. Sometimes they're privately owned, like a shop or a cafe. In many senses, these spaces are not well defined as either public or private. They're not public in the sense that they're inherently territorialized rather than being for everyone. They're not private in the sense that they're not hidden or domestic. They may be collectively or privately owned. They serve as arenas for the performances of some identities, but not for others. Publicity and privacy don't seem to be useful notions for getting at what's special and characteristic of third places. What distinguishes them is their fluid, territorialized, and social character, and their separation from work and home. They're their own kind of space, and they seem to be essential to flourishing urban life. If you don't have a third place or two of your own, you're missing out on a crucial part of what it is to live in and amongst others, including strangers, and to navigate shared spaces. I would say that you're missing out on a crucial part of urban living. And you can see this when you move to a new city. Even once you have a place to live and a job, it's the lack of third places of your own that most makes you feel like you're not yet at home in that city and not yet a part of it. And you know that you've moved for real and settled in for real once you have found your third places. I think that this is really important to think about in terms of what the COVID pandemic has done to cities. One of the ways in which it made cities so alienating and felt like such an assault on our identity and our at-homeness in the world for those of us who lived in cities was by shutting down third places. This varies across the world for how long this happened, but in American cities, it was a long time that third places were shut. So most of us still had home places, and many of us still had workplaces during the peak of the pandemic, but our third places were gone, and it was highly disorienting for city dwellers. So I want to suggest that access to third places is a key component of the right to the city, and it's one that doesn't reduce to any version of a right to public space or to private space. A just city should provide satisfying third places for all dwellers who want them. No third place, by definition, is for everyone. I don't belong in the vibrant Black men's barbershop down the street from me, and someone in a wheelchair is not going to find their third place at my boxing gym. These don't themselves constitute injustices. But if a city systematically fails to offer satisfying third places to its different kinds of residents, it has failed to support their flourishing and their right to the city. There are poor neighborhoods that are third space deserts because of some combination of a lack of businesses and services and because of a revanchist policing of what could be common spaces. And this is a specific form of injustice. It's a violation of these residents' right to the city. Teenagers, again, struggle to find third places. They're systematically denied just this kind of access to and use of space. And disabled people often have a much narrower range of third places accessible to them in a city. In highly patriarchal societies, third places become gendered, with lots of bars and parks and diners available for men and only very limited options for women, who are mostly expected to stay in the domestic realm. And notice that laws and movements to include disabled people or women in the workplace on full terms don't help with this third place problem. We have all sorts of policies in place to block workplace discrimination, but we have nothing in place to ensure equal access to third places. So cities need to take it seriously as a matter of justice, that they're designed so as to lend themselves to the development of third places, including for underserved groups. And it needs to be part of our urban planning to focus not just on making sure that people have homes and jobs and public spaces for things like assembly and protest, but also that the city provides a wealth of diverse third spaces and makes it easy for people to develop new ones that suit their needs on their own. And this means getting rid of revanchist laws that block their development, like loitering laws, for instance, and giving small business loans and other funding to people who want to create spaces of this sort. We should figure out which cities are good at providing third spaces and study their spatial laws and policies in material form and their informal norms with a specific eye to making our cities third place friendly and inclusive. Okay, instead of going through my last section of my paper on building an inclusive right to the city, I just want to show you a list of the kinds of spaces that I think we need to build, because part of my point in this talk and what I really want to end on is, on the one hand, because of the material forms of the city, people have unequal spatial agency and there's an enormous amount of spatial injustice in terms of what kinds of spaces people have access to and agency within. But on the other hand, the other big point of this paper is that there's a huge variety in terms of the kinds of spaces that people need. They don't just need homes, they don't just need workplaces, they need a whole wide range of public and shared spaces and third places. So let me find that. Yes, so this is some of the kinds of spaces that we need to build if we want to build an inclusive right to the city, which is a much richer and messier list of places than we usually get when urban planners talk about building an inclusive city, or when theorists of the right to the city focus only on public space taken as a uniform kind of space. And I think that I will end there because I don't want to overstep my time. Thank you.
Thank you, Quill. Thank you very much for that interesting talk. And let's join me, please, in this electronic digital applause. Round of applause. Thank you. Now we're going to have to Professor José Medina. So, Professor, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much. So let me take a moment to share the screen, and while I do that, I want to express my gratitude to Professor Juan Samuel Santos Castro for the invitation and for organizing this. Also, hold on a second. Yeah, thank you so much to the Pontificia Universidad Javeriana de Bogotá for organizing this event. And congratulations on the 50th anniversary of the PhD program in philosophy. So that's a big number, 50, right? So I hope that maybe the first cohort of doctoral students are among us. That would be really amazing. So thank you so much. And thank you also to Professor Kukla for sharing the stage with me and for that amazing presentation. Now, I have so many questions about Kukla's presentation that now I don't even want to go to mine. I just want to talk about all the rich and interesting issues that they have brought up. But we'll have at least a little bit of time and an opportunity to do that after my presentation. So let me go to my presentation. So as you can see there on the screen, I'm going to be talking about protest, the silencing of protest, and then also what I call epistemic activism, which is a notion that I have developed in recent publications, and also is a big part of my new book, The Epistemology of Protest. And it is a notion that goes beyond protest, because epistemic activism is any kind of activism that has to do with resisting communicative and epistemic dysfunctions, facilitating voices, facilitating the sharing of knowledge and understanding, facilitating access to the public sphere. So it applies to a bunch of different things, not only protesting, but it applies to protesting, especially as you will see for the last part of my talk, after I give an analysis of the different ways in which protest can be silenced. I will argue that we need to actively fight against the silencing of protest, and that requires epistemic activism. That requires a particular kind of activism. It's almost a meta-activism, activism about activism, or protesting about protest, protesting the silencing of protest. That will be part of what I call epistemic activism. And as you can see there in the image, right, which of course is one of the images from the 2020 uprising in the US, the Black Lives Matter protest and people taking to the streets, it does connect in important and interesting ways with what Professor Kukla was talking about, right? The right to the public sphere, the right to protest, includes the right to have access to public spaces, right? And not just, as I will tell you with different examples later on, not just any spaces, not just having the right to inhabit public spaces, but public spaces that are front and center in public life, which means to say it's not the same thing to have access to downtown, right, than to have access to peripheral neighborhoods where you can protest. Well, sometimes you want your protest to take center stage in public life, to be there front and center. And that is precisely what happened, right, with the uprising of 2020 and with Black Lives Matter. Not only they wanted to take to the streets, they wanted to take the streets that matter, to downtown streets, to every streets, right? And one of the famous chants was, whose streets, our streets, right? So we can come back to that, but oops, let me see. Oh, sorry. Yeah. So let me just very quickly tell you that I will divide my remarks into 3 different parts. In the first section, which will be very short, so they get to the second and third, I will offer some general remarks about how I see the complex communicative mechanism of protest. And in particular, I'm going to emphasize that one of the things that protest allows us to do is to forge solidarity and to express solidarity. And communicative solidarity is part of what I'm going to be calling echoing. And the argument here is going to be mostly this insight that a lot of the time, silence entails complicity, that remaining silent about injustices is tantamount to being complicit and expressing toleration with respect to that injustice. And from that insight, I'm going to develop an argument for the duty to protest. So the main claim is going to be that we have a duty to express solidarity against injustice. Not just the right to protest, but the duty to protest is what I'm interested in this section. Then in the second section, I'm going to talk about the different ways in which protesting can be silenced. And therefore, those ways of silencing protest are going to be roadblocks to forging and expressing solidarity. And they are going to be obviously a way of keeping people complicit with ongoing injustices. And finally, I will turn to what we have to do to resist the silencing of protest. And here is where I'll talk about epistemic activism. Okay, so first, protest and communicative solidarity. And as I already mentioned, a lot of the literature on protest in philosophy, at least, and in political theory also, is about the right to protest, but I'm more interested here in the duty to protest. Not only we have a right, of course, to express our discontent, our dissent, our outrage with respect to injustices, but we have a duty to do so. And let me start with this quote that is very important to me and actually captures the main insight of this section of the paper, of the talk. It is from Frederick Douglass, and it's a speech that he gave in the middle of the 19th century, and it says, find out just what any people will quietly submit to, and you have found out the exact measure of injustice and wrong which will be imposed upon them. And this will continue until they are resisted with either words or blows, or with both. The limits of tyrants are prescribed by the endurance of those whom they oppress. So part of what Frederick Douglass is saying here is, it is silence, it is that keeps injustices in place. When people start to express their intolerance with respect to injustice, then it is the beginning of the fight against injustice, the beginning of the interruption of injustice. So we can come back to this, but let me keep going. So protest is, of course, a very complex mechanism of political communication. And in particular, there are, I think, 4 functions that protest serves. And I'm not going to spend much time on all 4 of them, but I'll focus on the second one. So the first one is, protest is a form of voicing dissent in the public sphere. The second one is the one I'm interested in for the purposes of this talk, and that is, protesting is a way of expressing, but also not just expressing, forging solidarity. So that means a bunch of different things, but in particular, it means that you are creating and expressing solidarity. And in doing so, you are creating and expressing a public that stands against that kind of injustice that is in question. So that means to say that protesting is a very important mechanism for the constitution of a protesting public, not just for the expression of an antecedently existing public, but it is a part of what it needs to happen for the constitution of a protesting public. And this is very important to me, because pay attention to this. If you take this idea seriously, that it is in and through protest that a public is constituted, then when protests are silenced in systematic ways, for example, when they are prohibited, for example, then it is almost tantamount to the killing of a collective agent, to the killing of a public that cannot exist anymore in the public sphere, or the foreclosure of the possibility of that public so that it cannot be formed. And I think in my own reading of Du Bois, this is part of what he articulated actually in his own account of protest. And this is part of what he meant by saying that protest is the way in which a public becomes empowered and becomes a self-respecting public, as he puts it. And then also in protesting, what happens is that you try to secure visibility for the cause, and you try to garner public support for the cause and to create alliances. So it is also in this way that you are trying to forge solidarity, not only with or among the members of the protesting public, not only that kind of internal in-group solidarity, but out-group solidarity. And of course, protests are used for other things as well, in particular, developing and expressing public criticisms, articulating demands, and so on. So how do we forge and express solidarity in protest? Well, in many ways, right? A lot of the time it involves public gatherings. So the right to assembly, not only the right to freedom of expression, the right to free speech, but the right to assembly is crucial for protesting, right? The right to have access to public spaces and to gather in those spaces. This connects with Kukla's analysis very importantly. Occupying those public spaces, people standing together, marching, sitting in, staging die-ins, kneeling down, etc. Then, of course, protests can happen in other ways that don't require public gatherings, including virtual protests, right? Especially during the pandemic. Even before the 2020 uprising in the US, people taking to the streets, they were protesting online, right? And the two are connected. Even the Arab Spring, right? Many years earlier, it was such a big global event because people took to the streets and they occupied the public square, but also because of virtual communication and social media and so on, which is interesting too, because here we're still talking about the space, but it's not material space necessarily, it's virtual space, right? But there's also the importance of having access to a space, material and virtual space, and being able to speak in protest, to speak against injustices, to speak with other people, to be engaged in this collective voice. And then also, a lot of the time it's not about taking a space, occupying a space, using a space, or verbalizing anything. It is about acting, right? Doing things, particular things like boycotts, direct actions, strikes. Then also, it is important to pay attention to the fact that a protest is typically a very multi-layer, heterogeneous kind of communication that is addressed to multiple publics. So it is a form of address, but it is a form of address that typically involves multiple addresses or addressing multiple publics. Why? Because to begin with, even when nobody's listening, right? Even when there is no public receptivity or interest or attention in a protest, very often protesting is really worthwhile and really important because the protesters are talking among themselves and to each other, and they are addressing each other, and they are expressing their solidarity with each other. So that formation of in-group solidarity is very important. Now, the echoing of protesting voices, the echoing of the protest here happens internally in the sense that members of the protesting public are echoing each other and supporting each other communicatively, expressing communicative solidarity. But then, of course, a protest very typically also addresses an external audience or multiple external audiences. And in that sense, it aims at forging out-group solidarity as well, so that those other audiences will echo the cause and the protest and the protesting voices. Okay, so what is my general argument in brief about there being a duty to protest in order to avoid complicity with injustice? So the argument essentially can be captured in three interconnected ideas, 3 key points. The first one has already been developed and articulated by many people, most recently by Candice Delmas in a book from 2018 entitled A Duty to Resist. And even though the book is not about protest, it only has a few discussions about protest. The book is most about resistance in general, political resistance, and it's more about direct action. But it contains an argument for the duty to protest that is grounded in John Rawls, actually, and some of the Rawlsian political theorists. And that argument is that the duty of justice requires people to resist injustice. The duties of justice entail a duty to resist injustice. And the duty to resist injustice, Delmas argues, entails a duty to protest injustice. Now, even though she makes this claim and she sketches this argument, people could say, well, this argument goes a little bit too fast, because yes, I agree that if I don't want to be complicit, the duty of justice requires me not to contribute to any ongoing injustice, and even to try to resist ongoing injustices as much as I can. So, for example, if there are injustices against transgender folks, like restricted ways in which gender binaries are imposed on them, and for example, the North Carolina famous bathroom ordinance and so on, you can say, yes, I'm definitely going to resist those. I'm not going to support them in any way, and in fact, as much as I can, I will help, like, for example, if you're in a university community, I will help, the cause of gender neutral bathrooms. I will also be engaging in new practices of pronouns and so on, so that, and you may feel like, why do I have to go on record and engage in protest and express my public dissent about anything like transphobic legislation? I'm already doing my duty to resist injustice. Why do I have to protest? Why do I have to dissent publicly? My claim is that there are expressive harms that are there already and that are active against people affected by injustices that you are consenting to implicitly, that you are at least indirectly, passively complicit with, if you don't protest. Meaning by that, even if those transphobic laws are not used anymore, but they are still in the books, right? It is a way of telling the community transgender people can be discriminated against, even if they are not de facto right now. Or even if they are not in your particular community or in your particular part of the world. Well, that's why it is important for you, for anybody, to say, hey, I know that there is an expressive harm that is still outstanding, right? Which is that people can be treated this way, that we have legislation, that we have a public discourse that allows for people to be discriminated against. And in order not to remain passively, indirectly, tacitly complicit with those expressive harms, I have to speak up against that injustice. So that's the second point, that public dissent is needed in order to resist the expressive harms associated with injustice, and in order to interrupt your silence as a form of consent, right? And that's the crucial point. That's my point number two. Then elaborating on that, or a corollary of that, is that failing to resist injustice and failing to protest injustice is going to entail complicity. Either passive complicity through your silence and inaction, or active complicity that can happen by ways in which you talk, ways in which you speak, and you're actively, even if unknowingly, tolerating a form of injustice. In my view, at least, and we can come back to this if it is relevant, this argument and this insight was already developed in activism, in particular during the AIDS epidemic and with ACT UP, and the famous slogan, silence equals death, which in that context meant if there is a community that is vulnerable to death during the AIDS epidemic, the queer community, and the general public is looking the other way, and the institutions are looking the other way, if you don't say anything about it, if you don't denounce the social invisibility and inaudibility of what is going on, then you are actually contributing to that death by neglect. And that's what ACT UP did too, not only with their slogans, right, but also with some of their protests and their enactments and their performances, such as the famous die-ins. So that people were dying by the hundreds and by the thousands in a city like New York, but nonetheless, and before ACT UP, the city would go on, right? This goes back again to some of the things that Kukla has told us about. The city appeared just as if nothing was happening, as if it were business as usual, just the same. And what they did is all kinds of things, but they also did, blocking intersections with die-ins like you see on the street. I'm gonna have to go faster like Kukla, because otherwise I'm never gonna get to the end of my presentation. Okay, so there are different ways of discharging our duty to protest. Is, in my view at least, and there's an entire backstory here, but I don't have time to tell it. It's not always the case that people can join a protest or initiate a protest for all kinds of reasons, and that's okay. So sometimes you do want to discharge your duty to protest expressively by joining a protest or initiating a protest, but in other cases, you can discharge it at least reactively, meaning by that you can at least give proper attention to a protest and respond to it, give proper uptake to the protest. And therefore, there are at least two ways in which you can fail your duty to protest, expressively or reactively, and those involve different forms of complicity. Okay, let me go to the second section, because this is the one that I want to spend more time on, because it is my own analysis of the silencing of protests. And I want to distinguish 4 different types of silencing of protests in relation to the locution or the enunciation, the communicative act of protesting. So what I'm going to call the pre-locutionary silencing is the kind of silencing that happens even before the attempt to protest takes place. And this may involve prohibitions, but also ways in which communicative climates have developed, communicative environments have developed so that it makes it nearly impossible for people to protest. That's going to be pre-locutionary silencing. Then in the second place, when people do protest, so we have the attempt to protest, the illocutionary act of protesting. There are ways of neutralizing or voiding that act that I'm going to call illocutionary silencing. But then in the third place, even when the illocutionary act of protesting happens, so there is a protest, right? Protesting has taken place. And people, audiences, recognize that a protest has taken place. Nonetheless, in the interaction between the protester and the audience, right, there could be a give and take. There could be a communicative dynamic so that the protest act can be communicatively downgraded. It's still a protest, it's not illocutionary silence, but it is downgraded, it is manipulated, it is distorted, and it can include semantic distortions, ways in which the content of the protest doesn't go through, doesn't enter the public sphere in the way it should. And then finally, perlocutionary silencing, so that you have the protest, it is recognized as a protest, no illocutionary silencing, the content of the protest is recognized and understood, at least minimally, so no interlocutionary silencing of the kind I'm going to describe, but nonetheless, the possible perlocutionary effects of the protest are short-circuited. So for example, persuasion. Public persuasion becomes next to impossible for one reason or another. Okay, so pre-locutionary silencing. It is a kind of preemptive silencing. It can happen in different ways. The most obvious case is explicit restrictions on the freedom of speech or the freedom of expression or the freedom of assembly. But also, even without those prohibitions, even in liberal democracies, right? All over the world, in Europe, in the Americas, and so on, you have communicative environments that make it very, very difficult, sometimes almost impossible to protest. And that's going to be a kind of pre-locutionary silencing. Now, let me give you an example of that in the US. When there is display of police force on the streets the day in which a protest has been called, it is a way of intimidating the public to come out, to take to the streets. This is what happened, for example, in Ferguson in 2016. Tanks were on the streets during the day, militarized police force, and it was a way of intimidating people not to protest. Now, let me just say something brief about illocutionary silencing. So it can happen in different ways, but in general, we can describe it as a way of nullifying or the attempt to nullify the communicative force of the act of protesting so that it doesn't even appear as a protest anymore. How can that be done? Obviously, in many ways. In a couple of different articles, I have analyzed, for example, in the history of the US, how the rhetorical frame of rioting and looting, right, is deployed, especially when there are protests of people of color, so that the protesters are immediately perceived not as protesters, not as people engaged in political communication, but as rioters and looters. And that is what happened in the LA uprising in 1992, when the exoneration of the policeman who had brutally beaten up Rodney King was announced. People took to the streets, and yes, there was destruction of property, and we can talk more about that. But clearly, part of what happened, at least, was people trying to protest the verdict. People tried to protest the impunity with which police can deploy violence against people of color. And now, because it was depicted in mainstream media, not as an uprising, but rather as a riot, that was completely covered over, almost as if these people were not speaking, almost as if these people protesting on the streets were not engaged in communication at all. They were just making noise, right? They were not protesting, but rioting. And the same thing happened in the Ferguson protests in 2016, which in fact were described not as protests, but as riots. Now, it happened also, of course, during the most recent uprising here in the United States. And this attempt to illocutionary silence protesting voices came even from the White House. So Donald Trump famously said on May 28th, 2020, and I quote the tweet, "These facts are dishonoring the memory of George Floyd, and I won't let that happen. When the looting starts, the shooting starts." And notice that it is very interesting because he was saying this as the protests were taking place. So in that sense, it was an attempt to illocutionary silence the protesting that it was taking place. But at the same time, he knew that more protests had been called, not only in Minneapolis, but in other cities. So in that sense, he was preemptively silencing future protests, engaged also in pre-locutionary silencing. Okay, illocutionary silencing can be understood according to different models and different accounts of silencing that are available in the literature, especially in speech act theory. I'm going to give you two possibilities, and I favor the second one. So the first one is thinking about illocutionary silencing as a form of disablement. You disable the communicative agency of the protesters. And that is what Ray Lanston and Jennifer Hornsby, for example, have claimed, at least in some papers. So that they claim that the very communicative force of the act is rendered null and void. Now, there is a problem, well, there are all kinds of problems with this, including the ableist conceptualization here, using the term disablement and all of that, but also it doesn't really capture that a lot of the time illocutionary silencing is not simply saying these people are not communicating, they are making noises, but it is rather saying, well, they are communicating in one way or another, but not as protesters. And for that, the second conceptualization is more helpful, which comes from Kukla and the concept of discursive injustice that involves also what can be called illocutionary flipping, and Lubell Anderson and others have used this. So it is a subversion of illocutionary force, but a subversion that doesn't completely deplete the act of communicative force and communicative content, but the communicative force is subverted, manipulated, so it becomes a different kind of communicative act. For example, these people are not protesting, but they are insulting the police, or they are intimidating the public, or they are doing something else, which is still communicative, but not protesting per se. So, as Kukla puts it, discursive injustice, of course, quote, when members of a disadvantaged group face a systematic inability to produce a specific kind of a speech act that they are entitled to perform, and in particular when their attempts result in their actually producing a different kind of a speech act that further compromises their social position and agency. And I think this actually captures very well, and it applies very nicely to the case of protesters of color being unable to protest or to be perceived as protesters, and their communicative agency being subverted against themselves because of racial stigmatization. Okay, but there is also ways in which silencing continues even when something is recognized as a protest. So no illocutionary silencing, people respond to the protest as a protest, but nonetheless, in the communicative interaction, there is a communicative downgrading of the protest so that it is, because of the uptake that it is given, it is perceived as a defective protest, as an illegitimate protest. And a good example of that, that it involves a semantic distortion, is when people take to the streets and chant Black Lives Matter, and they encounter the response by some publics, some audiences, only Black Lives Matter. That response, in my view, is not illocutionary silencing, because it does not nullify the illocutionary force of the protest. It still treats the protest as a protest, but as an effective one. And the way in which I analyze that, following Lubel Anderson, there are aspects of his conclusions that I don't endorse, but the analysis, the core of the analysis, I still endorse, and it is the following. As Anderson says, the most natural interpretation of the claim Black Lives Matter as a protest in the context of the history of racism is that people are saying that Black lives have not mattered, or they have mattered less, and they should matter, or they should matter equally. So that's what he calls the inclusive interpretation. But what happened in what I'm calling interlocutionary silencing, what happens with the response of all lives matter, is that the audience is giving defective uptake because they're blocking that inclusive interpretation, and they're imposing an exclusive interpretation on the protesting voices, on their claim. So the exclusive interpretation is that they're saying, which of course they're not saying, only Black Lives Matter, right? We can come back to that, but that's my main example for this. Let me just say very, very briefly something about perlocutionary silencing, which is what happens when the protest is recognized as a protest and it is actually given at least minimal proper uptake so that the content is minimally understood, but nonetheless, the protest cannot make any difference in public discourse, in public life, because the consequences, the communicative effects of that protest are short-circuited. One way of doing that is to cutting off the protesting voices from the proper channels of communicative traffic, the proper channels of political communication, so that they cannot be given due consideration or carry any weight. In my view, the ways in which in the US freedom of speech zones were created, far removed from the rest of public life, like in far away parking lots, for example, as you have in the image, that creates very clearly a way in which the perlocutionary effects of the protests are not going to happen. They cannot happen. They are being short-circuited. It connects with at least one aspect of what Professor Kukla was telling us about, namely the right to share spaces and to have access to spaces. And I would say not any spaces, but those that are prominent and front and center of public life. So it is important that you are not confined to a freedom of speech zone, but you can march downtown and you can access fully prominent, visible aspects of public life. So this is another image of the same. As you can see, some of us there marching, but in far away, removed places. Okay, so, but there are other ways in which perlocutionary silencing can happen, and I have actually studied those ways in some articles too, so that there are mechanisms that could be in place to make sure that your protest is not taken seriously. So for example, within prison, and I have been engaged in prison activism, especially in the last 10 years, prisons have all kinds of problems and ways of confining the communicative agency of detained and imprisoned populations. For example, they can file grievances, but a lot of the times the way in which their grievances are handled are so that they make sure that they don't make any difference. So they get a response, an automated response, automatically generated response, but only low-level officials, really, if anybody in particular is reading the grievance, so it doesn't reach places. Or another ways in which demands raised in protests are rendered ineffectual is by depicting them as non-actionable. So this happens, for example, with prison abolition, but also police abolition, that they are depicted as, well, demands that we cannot do anything about because we don't know what that means. Or even if we know minimally what it means, there are no particular actions that follow from that, which is a distortion. So anyway, let me go very quickly to the last section of my talk. So let me conclude this with some insights I want to highlight. One is that resisting the silencing of protest is something that is actually crucial for the possibility of proper uptake actually existing. So if we don't fight against the silencing of protests don't stand a chance a lot of the time to have proper uptake, to be heard, to receive communicative attention, proper communicative respect, and minimal uptake. So that's the first thing I want to emphasize. And the second thing I want to emphasize is that the duty to protest includes the duty to fight the silencing of protest so that we don't become complicit with the ways in which individuals, publics, and institutions silence or engage in the silencing of protest. Okay, so how do we do that? How do we resist the silencing of protest? And I'm claiming that there is a specific form of activism that has to take place here, that is epistemic activism, that is almost like meta-activism, protesting about the silencing of protest, engaging in activism about activism, to facilitate activism, to facilitate protesting voices, and they're being heard and taken seriously. And given my analysis, I'm going to develop just a very quick, sketchy account of 4 different ways in which the epistemic activism against the silencing of protests can take place. First, by resisting pre-locutionary silencing. And that could involve all kinds of things, including denouncing and fighting against censorship and prohibitions and constraints on freedoms of assembly and freedom of speech. Then secondly, fighting against inhibitory communicative climates. Thirdly, proactively creating opportunities for people to protest, even under adverse circumstances. And I want to focus on the last one, and I want to say that very often, activists, protesters have to become epistemic activists because they have to break silences. They have to overcome obstacles for protesting. They have to circumvent communicative obstacles and even censorship. So let me give you some examples of that. And sometimes, and again, this could be connected with Kukla's account of space, sometimes that involves reconfiguring public spaces and social practices within those spaces, ways of inhabiting those spaces. And one, and I'm going to go very fast so that we have time for the conversation, the exchange between Kukla and myself, but also for Q&A. Let me just give you a brief example. The Madres de Plaza de Mayo in Argentina, in Buenos Aires, in 1977. During that time, the junta, right, had prohibited public gatherings. People could not protest. They couldn't assemble. They couldn't engage in public assembly. But of course, they could go to the square. They could go to the park. They could go in front of the Casa Rosada and sit on a bench or walk around the park. So that's what they did. They said, well, we're going to walk in the park, but also obviously with a political message. We're going to sit on the benches in front of the Casa Rosada, but of course, in a way that it is a protest. But then, of course, that was very powerful. It got a lot of attention, but of course, within a couple of months, the junta declared the state of emergency, and they took the Madres out of the Plaza de Mayo, and nobody could enter the square anymore. What did the Madres did? Well, they crashed another party, so to speak. They crashed a pilgrimage, and they said, well, religious pilgrimages are not prohibited. We're going to go to them, but we're going to wear our children's nappies as headscarves, so we're marching in the pilgrimage, but obviously it is a protest. It's a political march for us, and that's what they did in September. So these are some of the famous images that I'm sure people are familiar with from the 70s. These are commemorations of that 30 years and 40 years later, sitting on the bench where they started that protest. And then also I just want to mention, I was going to spend more time with this, but I don't have the time, that reconfiguration of public spaces and social practice can happen even in the most restrictive and confined spaces such as prison. And there too, people form a collective public and they engage in collective action, even though they can't, and even though it is prohibited and they have all kinds of restrictions. And I can give you examples of that that are really interesting, but for the sake of time, I'm going to move on. Now, how do we resist illocutionary silencing? How do we engage in epistemic activism against illocutionary silencing? One possibility is counter speech. We engage in counter speech every time there is a speech that is silencing protesters. So, for example, the speech of Donald Trump that I mentioned, or it doesn't have to be that particular version. Any kind of deployment of the rioting and looting rhetorical frame to depict people as rioters and looters and not protesters. Well, you can counter that by saying, wait, I'm calling out what you're saying, and I'm echoing the protesting voices as protesting voices, and I'm giving a counter speech of what is going on, hoping to neutralize your stigmatizing speech. And I think this connects with a recent account given by Ray Lanton and Laura Capone about how to resist illocutionary silencing by blocking presuppositions, and they give examples about irony and satire and so on, so that if you have an interlocutor that is silencing somebody else, you can say something like, oh, you must think that all women are X if they have, used a sexist presupposition in their speech in order to silence, or something like that. I claim, I'm still figuring out how this works, but I'm claiming that something analogous to that can happen even when the illocutionary silencing doesn't come from an individual and in an interpersonal dynamic, even when it comes from an institution, like the criminal justice system in the United States and the prison regulations, making so that prisoners cannot gather and detained subjects, detained populations cannot engage in protest. You could also say something to the prison system, right? And prison activists do that and write to the relevant authorities and write to the general public, hey, these regulations presuppose, and I'm going to try to block that presupposition, that any gathering of detained subjects is a gang or a danger to prison life. And that's not the case. Just because more than 2 people gather in the halls of the jail or the prison, that doesn't mean that they are gang members and that you have to prohibit that. But then more generally, just echoing protesting voices, echoing publics, not necessarily agreeing with them or furthering their agenda, but just echoing them as protesters becomes important for supporting their communicative agency as protesters. Okay, now resisting interlocutionary silencing, what does that mean? All kinds of things, but it involves fighting propaganda, fighting distortions that circulate in public life, compensating for the deficits, the communicative and epistemic deficits that protesting voices sometimes have, making sure that people can protest in their own terms, making sure that they can use their preferred language and that they can have access to public spaces to talk in the way they want to talk. And also engaging in active listening and making sure that other people, holding people accountable for being active listeners and not jumping to a distorting interpretation or just a different interpretation from the preferred one of the protesting public, and echoing the protesting voices and their own interpretation of their protest. And then finally, just resisting perlocutionary silencing. What does that mean? Well, it means all kinds of things, but among them, making sure that protests are not short-circuited and they can reach the public, and they can reach the public in the proper way. Also holding the general public and also the institutions accountable to protest and what they demand, echoing calls for reparative measures and steps toward rectification of injustice. And again, This doesn't necessarily mean that you have to agree with the protest, but you can say, look, this protest in public has been raising this issue for decades, and there is still unanswered. I, as a responsible member of the community, also want to say with them that they need an answer, that they need to be taken seriously, even if I don't agree with what they're saying. So that means epistemic activism, for example, this is what is in parentheses, involves fighting for accountability, for institutional accountability, for example, so that people get proper attention and proper uptake. So, for example, if prison abolition, police abolition are never taken seriously, that's perlocutionary silencing that need to be fought, even if you don't agree with abolitionism. But you should also say, as a responsible audience member, well, this needs at least due consideration. Okay, conclusions. I hope I have shown that expressing solidarity with legitimate protest is a requirement, not just an optional thing. I hope to have shown also that resisting the silencing of protest is very important, and it requires epistemic activism. And finally, I want to express, although it goes beyond what I have told you, it goes beyond the argument of the talk and the analysis of the talk, that expressing solidarity with protest and living up to that solidarity in a full sense involves very robust obligations. And here, I want to distinguish between thin solidarity and thick solidarity. And I want to raise the issue of how far, how deep your solidarity really goes. To begin with, deep communicative and agential engagements may be required. Not just agreeing or endorsing claims or taking them seriously, saying, well, yeah, I don't know if I agree or not, but this is a serious claim, but just communicatively engaging in a very important way. And also, in some cases, changing the way you talk, changing the way you act so that you can actively support protesting voices. And I'll stop there. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Jose, for this wonderful talk. And join me, please, in a round of applause, of virtual applause. Let me see, where's my, for this wonderful talk. That's it. So now we have a small conversation, a sort of a exchange. We haven't planned this. We don't know the specific format. So I just wanted to invite you to jump in and start conversation.
Do you want to go first, or do you want me to go first, Jose?
I have a few questions that I'm dying to ask. So I
go for it. Go ahead. Okay.
So yes, Quill, I really loved the account, and I'm so excited. So let me just focus on, I actually have more than 10 questions, but let me focus on a couple, or maybe 3 quick questions. One is how you see the right to the city and the right to inhabit, share the spaces in the city and so on, in relation to issues of indigeneity and issues of migration and displacement. And let me just tell you very briefly what I have in mind here. It seems to me that it's going to be very important to modulate or qualify what it means to have a right to the city. For example, first, with respect to issues of indigenous communities, because of course, and I'm thinking, of course, about colonialism, but also neo-colonialism, right? It is important whether or not, you know, in the case of indigenous community, that community has built the city, has been there for a long time, has a history with the city that other people don't have, right? With that space. And that becomes really important, so that it would be peculiar to say, well, everybody who happens to be there has an equal right to that space. It seems to me that the relation of the particular community in question with that space and the history of that relation becomes really important, right? But then, but then secondly, and almost going to the other extreme, right? When it comes to immigrant communities, displaced communities that very often, right, are allowed, if they are allowed to be part of the city at all, they are allowed to settle at the outskirts of the city. And I'm thinking, for example, about you know, people who have been displaced because of colonialism in Europe, going to Paris, going to London, the Algerian community, right? throughout the 20th century in Paris, Caribbean communities in London, and so on. Well, these people are newcomers, right? They have recently arrived, but then the interrelation of spaces, the interrelation of cities, right? Paris and Algeria, right? London and Jamaica, and so on, becomes really important, because you cannot just say, oh, you just came to the city, you don't have a special right to the city, or you can be confined to the... So I'm wondering how exactly you think the right to the city can be modulated to account for how particular communities, and I have in mind indigenous communities on the one hand, and secondly, displaced communities, immigrant communities, can lay claim to the city in particular ways. And if I may, just one more thing, so that those two are connected. But if I may, because I do have a lot of questions, but I want to raise one more that is actually, I think, really important, which connects very directly with this really important distinction between private and public, right? That you were drawing in different ways, in very rich ways, public spaces and private spaces. And I'm very concerned, I'm sure you have read a lot about this and have thought a lot about this. Of course, this trend of the privatization of public life and the privatization of public spaces, and more specifically with respect to protest, which is what I'm interested in,
yes.
right? How malls, for example, in the US, right, malls, and there is legislation and there has been debates about this, how malls, because they are considered private property, sometimes have a right that have been debated in courts, right, to say, no, the Mall of America, even though it is a municipality and it has, you know, schools and it has, right, a police station. I mean, it is a municipality, it's a town, but nonetheless, they have succeeded in courts to say, well, but it's still a private space. We don't want people protesting here. So right. I'm concerned about that too, right? And of course, that goes also to the privatization of virtual spaces, right? So that people cannot use, you know, Twitter or whatever it is, or Instagram or anything to protest in the way they want. So, and I have more stuff, but I know we have very little time. So let me stop there.
So these are huge questions and they're very good questions, and I won't be able to give full answers, but let me try to say something quickly to both so that I have time to ask you at least one question also. On the first point about indigenous communities and immigrant communities and the right to the city, this is actually an issue that's super important to me in thinking about this topic, and it's part of why it's so crucial to my account. And this is a big difference between my account of the right to the city and almost everybody else that I've read, that the right to the city is not the right to the whole city. It's the right to a range of different kinds of territories that meet the different needs that we have as flourishing individuals. So indigenous people who were first in a city have special claims over certain parts of the city. And for example, you know, in my book, I have a whole chapter on gentrification and the way in which the right to the city does not mean that you get to just come in and claim and gentrify a neighborhood, which would be another, that's not indigeneity, but it's a clearly related area, right? So I want to be able to say at one and the same time, it's important to those communities that their right to the city involves having certain parts of the city as their territory that are not available for everybody to claim as their own territory. And at the same time, that everybody who's in the city needs to have not only some territory, but a range of good quality territories that allow flourishing. But that doesn't mean they get to claim any territory they want, right? Like I used the example in my talk of how the black barbershop on my block is never going to be my third place, right? That is not my territory for me to claim. And that's important to recognize, and that's not a spatial injustice. But at the same time, if I have no place that I can claim, then that is a spatial injustice. And what I want to say is that, and this I did not say in the talk, I think it's essential to our concept of the just city, cities specifically, that they are welcoming and inclusive, and that anybody can find a place there. So even though issues of indigeneity are complicated, I want to say that the city is a kind of entity that needs to include everybody, but just because it needs to include everybody doesn't mean that it needs to include everybody everywhere. And then conversely, with respect to the immigrant case, if we say, okay, you can come to our city, but you have to live in this remote exurb and be sectioned off in this area that has very few services and isn't well connected to jobs and isn't well connected to the vibrant heart of the city, then you're providing them with a territory, but it's not the kind of territory that supports the right to the city and all of those dimensions that I talked about. It's not the kind of territory that allows for a flourishing and full urban life. And so that's an insufficient way of accommodating them. So I think my emphasis on the fact that we have a range of territories, but our territory is never the whole city, is the key to sort of addressing some of the issues that you're getting at. With respect to the second issue that you raised, wait, I'm sorry, I've lost my train of thought. Give me like 2 keywords to remind me what that one was.
Well, mainly the privatization of public spaces,
privatization, yes.
The Mall of America.
Yes. Yeah, I mean, this is something that I'm very concerned about that I did not have time to talk about in my talk at all, which is that I think that capitalism left to its own devices will eat all of city space. And when it eats all of city space, what it does is it makes itself it makes it so that people who have the most market power and the most purchasing power are the ones who get to define that territory. So one of the ways in which the privatization of space is very concerning to me is that it's not just a way of making the space literally exclusionary in the sense that you say, well, it's a private space now, so you can't come in or you can't protest here or you can't do whatever, but it will homogenize space so that the people who have the most market power to determine what kind of space it is will be the ones who give meaning to that space. And so protecting space from, this is one of I talked about this in the last section that I never got to, unfortunately, but one of the jobs that I think is the moral responsibility of urban planners is to institute the kinds of land use controls and provisions that keep capitalism from eating all of space, because capitalism just consumes space. And when it consumes space, it not only privatizes it, but it privatizes it in a way that is going to turn it over to the same people over and over and over again to give it meaning. And that's going to exclude all of those other kinds of territories. Very quickly, I just want to, this isn't even a question so much as I want to raise this as a fascinating connection between our talks and give you a moment to hear what you think about it. But unsurprisingly, I loved your account of the different kinds of silencing of protest. And I was trying to figure out where my concern about the over-orchestration and choreography of protest fits in that typology of silencing, because I guess it's a form of perlocutionary silencing, because obviously if a protest space is over orchestrated, it's still recognized as a protest. But what it does is it sort of consumes and co-ops the protest. So now the protest becomes a matter of this fits within the meaning top down of this city. And look, the city is allowing this protest to happen, but it contains it and keeps it in a particular place. And it doesn't allow for the reconfiguration of public spaces that you were talking about, which I think mutes its ability to be powerful. It becomes just a display of the power of the very people who are being protested against. And so I'm not even sure that it's exactly kind of silencing, but it was super interesting to think about it in terms of your typology. I think that kind of, one thing it shows is that, you know, when you were talking about how we need not any old protest space, but protest spaces that are prominent and central, prominence and centrality aren't even enough. Because if you have a prominent central protest space, but it's over controlled and it's over orchestrated and it's over choreographed, it co-ops and cuts off the power of that protest. which is why these protests like the one that you were talking about that sort of take over the city are much more powerful. So I'm curious if you had any thoughts about that.
Well, thank you so much. Actually, I think that's really, really helpful and really, really rich. So yeah, I agree with you completely that not only having access to prominent central public spaces and having people who are paying communicative attention to you in the right way and so on, but more than that is needed, right? Because there is still ways in which protesting voices can be co-opted. And you are absolutely right that there is that concern about over-orchestration and so on. That right. If you think about most of the big marches and demonstrations in the Washington Mall, right, of the kind that you were describing and so on, I do agree with you that there is room there, and there are many good examples of this, of co-optation happening, right, and distortions happening. I wouldn't call them pre-locutionary or illocutionary silencing, but I think they could be, as you already mentioned, perlocutionary silencing, because there are ways of narrowing down what people are really doing and saying. But also it could be what I'm calling interlocutionary silencing, in the sense that there are ways in which what you're saying, what the protesting public is saying, is not understood or appreciating in its full richness. Mm-hmm. And one of the ways in which I do this in the book manuscript that on protest that is currently under review is that I pay attention to the ways in which, not only from the outside, right, institutions, the media, and so on, may be co-opting what a rich, diverse protesting public is trying to express in the public sphere, but very often the protesting public itself, in the way in which protests are staged, managed, right, by organizations and so on, can include ways in which certain voices of the protesting public become marginalized or silenced, right, within the protest. So that in the Women's March, for example, or in the Million Man March, right, in also queer protests that happen in the Washington Mall, there are voices that don't are not heard, that they are at least not equally, right? So there's a kind of co-optation that can happen from within the protest movement already, right? And there is also, and I'm sure you have that in mind as well, the co-optation that happens in the interaction with external audiences, right? So for me, those would be the second, the third and fourth kind, interlocutionary silencing or perlocutionary silencing. But this is very useful, and I do agree with you that I have to be careful, because it's not only about, being able to protest and having access to the right spaces so that you have visibility. It is also how you enter those spaces and the communicative dynamics that happens within those spaces. So yeah, I agree with you. So thank you so much. That's very useful.
We could keep going, but I want to make sure there's a little bit of time for questions. So I'm going to stop.
I agree.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, that's wonderful. And yeah, we could keep on, but yeah, we have to, and we have questions already. So let me see. First, Nicole Bess, go ahead.
Hello. Sorry, I'm on my phone.
Hi.
Thank you so much for both talks. It's lovely to hear you both, being a student of both, so it's great. I have two questions about failure. One for Quill and one for Jose, I suppose, but maybe they cross over. One is whether, and I think it's linked to what Jose was saying before, one is whether these third places can be failing or can be negative or can be hurtful. When they're imposed or when they are neglectful, but I'm thinking of similar scenarios as the ones Jose was talking about, and so, for example, migrants using the highway around Paris as a third space of socialization and cooperation in many ways, but also inevitably it being quite hurtful, or in places that become riddled with other problems of violence or drugs, and so can should the notion of the third space be qualified as either positive or negative? And then the other question that I had is when Jose was talking about the forms of resistance to illocutionary flipping or discursive injustice, it seemed to me that in the example about Trump, with comparison with the other treating of looting before, there seems to be the question of when does an illocutionary silencing fail, or what are the conditions of possibility for that failure. And so maybe I'm very interested in this more structural aspect of what discursive strategies beyond what the individual can do, but what are the conditions in general for such silencing to become structurally impossible, or more impossible, I don't trust, but that it becomes more plausible that they fail. And I was thinking of the example of looting, because there's been a lot of reaction against this view of looting as not a form of protest, right? A lot more than there was in the past. Thanks.
Yeah, I'll go first since your first question was for me. Yeah, I think that a lot of third places are problematic and unhealthy in two different ways, one of which is the one that you mentioned. So, I mean, what we see in the people who are using the side of the highway as a third place is a failure of the city to have provided safe, flourishing third places for that group of people. And that's exactly why I want this included as part of what a just city owes people, because they can say, oh, well, we gave them a homeless shelter and we gave them a works, a work center, so we're done, right? But if people find themselves on the margin of a city with no place that they can treat as a third place other than these very dangerous environments, then that is a failure of the city that we are not usually noticing in terms of giving right to the city to everybody. But the other way that third place can be very unhealthy is that it inherently has insiders and outsiders. That's part of its nature. But sometimes the way the insiders are defined is by contrast and subordination of outsiders, right? So spaces can become exclusionary. For example, there are women's spaces that are trans exclusionary, that are self-defining on the basis of who they're keeping out. And so there's a very fine line between saying it's healthy to have spaces that have insiders and outsiders that are ours and that are our territory on the one hand, but unhealthy for those insiders to be defined in terms of their rejection or their subjugation of the outsiders, right? And that's a very dangerous line that gets played all the time. So that's another way in which I think that third spaces can go very wrong. And I'll let Jose. Oh, sorry.
I'm just gonna add, even when third spaces become the way in which the city justifies not providing private spaces, for example, yes, or homes. That's I've seen that.
That's a great point. Yeah, great point.
Yeah, just very briefly about the failure of silencing, right? How can we determine whether or not the silencing is successful or unsuccessful? And that's a great question. And a very difficult question to answer, and it applies not only to illocutionary silencing, right, but all kinds of silencing, the 4 types that I have identified. But let me tell you what my view is, just very briefly. For me, it is not an all or nothing issue, it's a gradual issue. And also it is a contextual issue. And those two things are important because the silencing, the attempt to silence a protest, can be more or less successful, right? It may not completely silence the protest, but it can silence the protest to some degree. So it's a gradual thing, but also it's contextual in the sense that it may be successful in one context and in one respect, but not in another. Now, for example, focusing on illocutionary silencing, of course, it does matter very deeply the authority, the power of the silencing attempt. So if it comes from the institutions themselves, if it comes from the White House, if it comes from the government, right? If the government is not recognizing a protest as a protest, but they are treating it from the beginning as rioting and looting, and they are deploying the military, and they are trying, then obviously, even if the general public doesn't buy it, even if the general public still thinks, no, but that is a protest, you are repressing this protest and claiming that it's not a protest, but it is. So in this case, for example, the institution, for institutional purposes, has illocutionary silenced the protest, even if it is not the case that in every respect the protest is not perceived as a protest anymore, right? But then also there are not only institutional voices and institutional positions that have a special responsibility and power with respect to silencing, also the media, for example, they can play a huge role in silencing, right? And a lot was said about the images of Katrina in which people were depicted as looters when they were trying to survive, right? Now, not everybody is going to buy those images. Not everybody is going to endorse the rioting and looting depiction of what is going on, but some people will, right? And others will not. So there could be a partial silencing, even if there is no complete silencing. But you're absolutely right that there are conditions, felicity conditions, so to speak, success conditions for the silencing itself, for the attempt to silence. And that's very important. Yeah. So thank you.
Okay, thank you. Next, we have Jose Hernandez. Jose, go ahead. Jose? Yep.
Hey, thank you. Really, I would like to start by thanking Quill and Jose. Their explanation was really clear and very sourceful for us, that we learn a lot. I would like to start by trying to answer the last question that Jose was trying to answer, and I would say that a protest in silencing it can be successful when the protest itself doesn't achieve to convey the meaning or the purpose of it all. What do I try to say? Protest itself were born trying to transform the social and political conditions of a very specific context. Let's go and try to approach to history with the springs of the peoples. I'm sorry, I'm a bit nervous.
You're fine.
When I try to bring to the topic the spring of the people is the wish of democratic conditions in terms of political and social conditions. When we bring the spring of the people in today's, it's not about just reducing protests in terms of striking and looting. It goes beyond, and I'm trying to express what protests in Colombia are right now. For example, public and private places here are intertwined. You know why? Institutions like Comisión de Verdad are trying to take places, public and private places, such as institutions, such as classes, those places go to the public in terms of how educative goals can transform the needs of a protest. It's not just about expressing solidarity and visibility. It goes beyond. For example, if I'm saying protest can transform into empathy, it's not just about solidarity. It's about you trying to be in the shoes of another's one. You see, and that opens the perspective of the protest, how it's being presented. It's not just about you take a public space and you try to do an artistic movement. And I'm trying to express how valuable is to go to take the classes from a private or public university or classroom or institute such as Humboldt to the street and to say, hey, let's transform this protest in terms of how can these people transform their wish to need to transform their social, political, and cultural needs in terms of more plausible and doing and change the practical conditions. And I want to close. God, I want to close in terms of how cinema can provide a new, can provide a new field to protest. And I want to talk about the Candyman movie, the 2021. You can say it's a horror movie, it's okay, but the last picture of the scene of this movie, it talks about how a myth, it began with a social injustice, a racial social injustice. And when you try to convey the problem of how the painting and the artist develop in a social and a political issue from the time, and it goes from time to time because it has been unanswered, you can see from the cinema another perspective. You can try to, how can art can change protest itself? It's not just about go on route, go and just take a place in public place. It goes beyond, I think. I don't know if I'm making myself clear from the nervousness, but thank you so much.
Yeah, I completely agree with everything you have said. So yeah, for me, protest is, as you emphasize, about social change, right? And it is about bringing about justice and correcting injustices. So I agree with you completely that it's not only about communication, and it's not just a communicative gesture. It is way more than that. And in my book on protest, yes, I have, as you said, exactly as you said, actually, I have a chapter on how protest connects with regenerating public sensibility, creating new forms of sensibility. I have also a chapter about how protest is an intervention in the public imagination, in the social imagination. I also have a chapter on how protest is about changing material realities, remaking space, as Kukla was saying, right? The Occupy movement is a very good example of that. Remaking spaces and remaking social relations, remaking. So I agree with all that completely, but it is also a communicative mechanism that connects with all those ways in which protest is trying to create change. And as a communicative mechanism, I agree with you that the content of the protest, that's what you started saying, right? That you thought that silencing was all about meaning, about blocking the meaning of the protest, the content of the protest. And I think that's right, because of course, when the communicative content of a protest is not heard, or is not heard properly, the protest is not going to be able to do the transformative work that it wants. But even though it is in general right that the silencing has to do with the communicative content of the protest, with the meaning, it's not entirely right, at least in the following sense, that silencing also happens independently of the content of the protest, and even if a protest doesn't have any specific communicative content. So think about a silent march, think about a sit-in, think about all kinds of protests that don't have content, but nonetheless, they can be silenced if people don't recognize that what is going on is a protest. If they don't recognize that people are trying to dissent or to take to the streets, to take to the public sphere to express something. So I agree with you in general. I still think it's important to recognize protest as a communicative mechanism and to recognize the different ways in which it can be derailed, the different ways in which it can be silenced. So I hope that helps somehow.
Okay, thank you, Jose. I have next to Bernardo, but he wrote his questions on the chat, so I'm gonna read them. So thank you for these great talks. I have some questions for Professor Medina. What are your views on secret protests like migrant smuggling? Are they still communicative? Are they silent protests? My second set of questions relates to the limits of the duty to protest. The risk of protesting are contextual. Often only the participants understand the risk they are facing. Sometimes not even they understand it. Is it right to demand protest and interpret silence as inaction as complicity when agents cannot speak or act? Couldn't this be a form of academic epistemic injustice, namely ignoring the risks others face if they speak up, judge their silence as complicity? Also, do all injustices entail the same duty to protest for everyone? Shouldn't we consider differential duties depending on the agent's situation, the relationship to the victims of the injustice, or the benefits they get directly or indirectly from the injustice? So that's Bernardo's questions.
Well, that's a lot of questions. I don't know if I'm going to be able to answer all of them, but let me just say something very brief about at least different aspects of the different questions formulated. One is that, yes, so my view, protest actions without a speech, without saying anything, of course, are protest. And in my view, because a protest action, even when it is non-discursive, even when it is without a speech, is trying to communicate something. It is still an expressive act, right? It can be silence. So I still want to say that in that case as well, we need to talk about silence or the blocking of the expressive content, the expressive communication that a protest is. Then I also, of course, want to distinguish between different kinds of protests and different kinds of injustices that the protests are responding to. And it is true that not all injustices are the same. So in particular, what is typically called a structural injustice or oppression, because of the features of structural injustice and oppression, they have priority over other injustices that are more isolated or don't have structural elements. I also have in my own account of how to prioritize whether to protest one injustice or another, the severity of the case. If we're talking about life and death issues, if we're talking about an epidemic, a social epidemic, such as police killings, then of course that should take priority over other things that are not about life and death. Then just to add one more thing, finally, yes, it is true that sometimes there are actions that are protest actions of one way or another, but they happen covertly, and they don't seem to be a call, an open call for solidarity or anything like that. There is even in the literature of anti-racist protest, even in the literature on abolitionism and the abolition of slavery, there are covert protests of slaves, of enslaved populations. And at the beginning, when I got into this literature, I was a little puzzled because I was like, well, a covert protest is kind of an oxymoron. If you are protesting, how do you want it to be secret? How do you want it to be covert? But actually, it makes sense if you think about the different audiences that a protest can have. You may, in some cases, want your protest to be hidden from some people, from some audiences, even from the institutions or from the general public, from mainstream society, because you want to protect yourself and you want to protect your community, but you are still protesting. And some of the slave protests, right, were exactly like that. They were protesting in the sense that they were boycotting, you know, the plantation. They were boycotting all kinds of things, but they were doing, and they were telling each other that they were boycotting things, but they were doing so covertly to protect themselves and so that the protest could continue. So there are interesting cases like that that I think I can accommodate, but it is true that it's not all about communicating in the public sphere openly and visible to everybody. And I'll stop there.
Thank you. Yeah, thank you, Jose. So next goes Germán Sarmiento.
Okay. First off, can you guys hear me? Okay,
yeah,
so first off, I want to thank both presenters for your presentations. Very, very thought-provoking. I thought they were both very interesting. So my question is for Dr. Kukla. On the topic of third places, I found it interesting that the examples you gave were mostly consumer-driven, but like coffee shops or barber shops. But of course, you did say that they are not necessarily, you know, focus on that aspect. They can both be public or private. And it got me to think, and I would like to hear your thoughts on specifically on private third spaces that are consumer driven. I thought about coffee shops. So when you see a coffee shop in a neighborhood anywhere, there's the option of, you know, the locally owned coffee shop and then a Starbucks, right? So I was thinking if there is any, I think you kind of mentioned it when you guys started having the conversation, and you touched on gentrification and how territory plays a role. Like not all third spaces will be responsive to every single person that wants to be in the city. So my question is there some sort of hierarchy when it comes to third spaces and in the way they are established? So what I'm specifically thinking of is it better, and why is it better to have a locally owned coffee shop where the owner lives in that same neighborhood or in that same city versus a Starbucks that it's owned by a corporation or it's owned by someone that doesn't really belong to that city in the first place?
Thank you. It's a great question. I actually had a line about Starbucks in the talk that I never got to, but so, I mean, one of the things that I wanted to say was that there are places that try very hard to market themselves as third places, like Starbucks, that fail because of, I think, a combination. I mean, so first of all, I think Starbucks is a failed third place. There are very few people who actually feel like Starbucks is their place, you know? And I think this is for two reasons. One is it has some of the same over-orchestration problem as I was talking about when I was talking about protest spaces, that the space is too top-down controlled and designed, and it doesn't allow people to intervene and make that space their own in the right way. Like every Starbucks everywhere looks the same and is, you know, the music is controlled and the color scheme is controlled, and people can't really intervene on that space and make it a space that fits them in any interesting way. So that's one way in which it fails. And then a related way in which it fails is that it's not specific to the neighborhood or to the particular people who are trying to use it as their territory. It's just, it's a fungible, interchangeable space. And so it's not responsive. So in terms of why it's better to have an independently owned coffee shop, I mean, part of it is about not supporting corporate capitalism, and that's a separate point from the whole third places point. We can bracket that, right? There are good economic reasons to want to support the independent coffee shop over the big corporation. But I think that's not really the point when it comes to third places. I think that local independent coffee shops, there's more often a positive feedback back and forth between what the people in the neighborhood want that space to be and the space that's provided. And the space shapes itself to the people, and the people shape themselves to their space. And that's the kind of third place that works the very best, is the kind where people have some spatial agency and the space reflects them and they're helping to make it in some important way, right? You know, not every independently owned coffee shop is flexible in this way, but the good ones are responsive to the neighborhood. They're not just coming down and plunking down an overly designed space that people can't intervene on. And, you know, what books are in there and what music is getting played and how it's arranged and so on is going to be responsive to the particularities of the people who are using that place. Even the subway platform that I talked about at the beginning of that section of my paper, the subway platform that we all hung out on when we were teenagers, like we wrote on the walls, and we weren't supposed to write on the walls, but why is that important? We were marking that place as our place. And I would argue that that kind of like graffiti gesture is a way of territorializing the space that you can get away with on a subway platform and that you can't get away with in the Starbucks, which actually, you know, it seems like a silly minor thing, but it's a way of marking this as my space that I contributed to, and I had something to do with how it looks and how it feels. And the best independent coffee shops are reflections of their neighborhood. They're not just something that was dropped down into the neighborhood with a particular choreography. Another way of putting, and I'll stop talking after this, but another way of putting this point is to use the language that I introduced in the talk of place ballets, right? Is the place demanding a specific rigid place ballet that was invented top down in some corporate office, the way that a Starbucks is? Or is the place ballet allowed to arise organically in relationship to the people who are using the space? And I think the best kinds of third places are always the ones where that place ballet arises organically to some extent. Otherwise, you have something that's too stiff and too inorganic and too overplanned to actually feel like anybody's territory. But it's a great question. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you very much. So there is a comment by Julio Patiño in the chat. I don't see a question, but I'm going to read it and then I'm going to ask Julio if he has any question. So, hello, I want to thank Jose and Quill for the presentation. I think the concept of third space is crucial because it brings an important political rupture into a limit or duality, rest, work, public, private, or territorial borders. This third space acts as an intermediation between delimited spaces, either for good or bad. It brings something different from which the dual spaces are already managing. I'm also thinking in paraconsistency logic or fuzzy logic, and to take this into politics. These logics are also called tolerant logics. So these third spaces invite us to embrace tolerance political practices. So this is a comment. So Julio, do you want to ask a question based on that? Julio Patiño? Well, maybe the question is about the relationship between the concept of third spaces and paraconsistent logic, fuzzy logic. Do you have any thought on that, Quill?
I wish that he were here so that I could get more of a sense of how he's drawing that connection. The only connection that I can draw at the moment is via the idea that, like I said, that they can be both public and private at once and neither private nor public at the same time. So in that sense, if you think of privacy and publicity as a duality, then they are violating that duality. But I would argue that that was a problem with our original dualistic thinking, that it's not so much that they follow a paraconsistent logic, as that it seemed like there was a dualism there that wasn't really a dualism to begin with. But it's an interesting comment, but I think I would need more context to say more than that.
Yeah, that's fine. So there's a question by Mario Ruiz. What is the role of segregation in the right to the city and protest? And I guess that question is for both of you.
I guess that's for both of us, right?
Yeah.
Do you want to go first, Jose, since I just talked?
No, you go first, because it's more about the space, I think.
I mean, top-down segregation, I don't know that I have anything very deep to say. I think that the only thing I would say is that top-down segregation is just a direct violation of the right to the city, right? So on the one hand, I was very insistent that not everything is everybody's territory, but to absolutely exclude people from, I mean, the thing is that whenever there's segregation, it's not just that people are segregated into equal but separate areas, but they get segregated into areas that without fail have less access to the opportunities for flourishing that a city provides, right? They are cities that are third place desert. I mean, they're neighborhoods that are third place deserts, they're job deserts, they're food deserts. They are cut off from the buzz of the city and the space of unplanned encounters that is so important to city life that I was talking about. And so There's just no example of segregation that isn't an example of denying people the kind of territory that they need to flourish in the city. And I think that the fact that we have separate territories to some extent from one another can never be legislated or like forced top down, or it's going to turn into that kind of violation of the right to the city. At the same time, it's a little bit tricky because I'm thinking about Jose's pushing of me during our exchange on the topic of indigeneity. Like, we do want to reserve some areas of the city for particular people and give them special rights over those people. And that is in some sense a kind of a segregation, but it's not typically what is meant by segregation, right? So forced integration is also a bad idea, because forced integration is going to undermine those kinds of territories that belong to groups that need help holding on to their territories. But the counter to the problems with forced integration should not be segregation. I hope that that's helpful.
Yeah, I agree with, if I may add just one thing about that, because I do agree with everything you said, Quill, and I think it's really helpful. But one thing that is important, obviously, is to take into account the dynamics and the history of the place and the different communities involved, because obviously there are cases in which you do want to allow for safe spaces. And sometimes safe spaces that a community should have, right, without other people who may be inhabiting their voices and their agency intruding, include some form of segregation, right? I mean, this connects with your point about forced integration, right? Maybe this community needs time and space, right, to develop a voice, to develop an agency, to feel at home before they can welcome other people into that space. Or maybe, as you were alluding to, and then there are special circumstances, like with respect to the indigeneity, it could be a sacred space for this community. And it's not just for everybody to use in any old way they want, right? And then when you're thinking about the communicative dynamics, right, that can take place and how people's agencies are going to be contending with each other, there are all kinds of things to consider. Like, for example, of course, in general, right, I am all for spaces for public protest being open to everybody. And I have written, of course, about in defense of the right to counter protest. And it is absurd to think that when you give a permit to protest to white supremacists, for example, on the streets of Charlottesville, you're giving them a right to have a hegemonic control over that space so that they cannot be counter protest. I mean, I obviously think that is the way to go, but nonetheless, sometimes when there is a community that has not had a public voice and they want to protest, you don't want necessarily to open that space at that time to every possible counter protest, that happens, because then you also have the danger of white supremacists coming in and not allowing minorities to protest. So I think it is contextual. I think it has to do with the dynamics and the histories of the place in question. But this is just an addition or a footnote to what Quill was saying earlier.
And I fully agree with all of that. I think that's an important qualification. Yeah.
Okay, that's great. So we have time for one last question. Miguel Ángel.
Gracias. Buenos días. Voy a preguntar en español y le voy a pedir el favor al profesor Santos que nos ayude con la traducción. En realidad, en primer lugar, quisiera agradecer especialmente a profesor Kukla y al profesor Medina por aceptar la invitación, por compartir con nosotros en la Javeriana. Estoy muy agradecido y, como dijo alguna de las personas que intervino, tener la posibilidad de escucharlos al tiempo y de verlos interactuar y discutir es supremamente enriquecedor y es un privilegio que tuvimos en esta conferencia. Rara vez tiene uno a dos especialistas y a dos intelectuales de esta talla conversando de esta manera. Muchas gracias. Tengo una pregunta para Kukla, y es si nos pudiera regalar una pequeña observación acerca de cómo ve el uso del espacio tan diferente, o no sé si lo ve tan diferente, en Bogotá, en Sudáfrica y en Berlín. ¿Qué tan diferentes ve los usos del espacio público en estas tres ciudades. Y para el profesor Medina quisiera preguntarle, agradeciendo también esta supremamente enriquecedora perspectiva de aprovechamiento de la teoría de los actos de habla para su discusión sobre la protesta, si ve alguna diferencia entre asumir un enfoque más justiniano y un enfoque más sirleano en la teoría de los actos de habla para las conclusiones y los análisis que él realiza. Eso es todo. Muchas gracias de nuevo y gracias.
I'm going to need help translating the one that was for me.
Yeah, for sure. Well, first I want to translate also the first part, which was thanking you for being here and for sharing your thoughts and your research with us, and having you both here talking to each other is a big privilege. I support that myself. I support that grateful. I'm very grateful, as Miguel Angel is. So now the question. The first question was for Quill, and the question is about: do you have any thoughts on the differences or similarities in the use of public space, urban space between Bogota, Bogota, South Africa, and Berlin?
Oh, it's such a big question. It's such a big question. Yeah, so this is somebody who knows that those are the cities that I work on. Yeah. What interests me a great deal about Berlin and South Africa that I think makes them distinctive, and part of the reason that I chose to study those cities, is that they are what I call repurposed cities, which is to say that they were built, materially built, for a very specific social order that was supposed to be very controlled top down, right? The division of Berlin during the Cold War on the one hand, and apartheid in South Africa on the other hand. And then, and those orders were, they built those cities to keep people in very specific places and to give them specific possibilities for agency and so on. And then those orders ended very abruptly at around the same time in the early 90s. Both of those orders collapsed. And people came into the city who were new to the city, and they had to figure out how to use those material spaces that had been built for something quite different. And so what happened in both cases is that the cities, people could repurpose the city and give it new meaning at a much faster and more dramatic, in a much faster and more dramatic way than we usually see in a city. Right, so factories that had been decommissioned in East Berlin suddenly turned into squatter camps or art galleries or protest spaces or whatever they may be. And people reused space and changed its meaning. So in terms of what Jose called reconfiguring public spaces, we saw it happen very, very quickly of necessity in those two cities. And that gave rise in both cases to a kind of a radical creativity over how space was used, including public spaces, spaces that had been designed to be private spaces turned into public spaces, spaces that are designed to be public spaces turned into third spaces. You had all kinds of transformations of space very quickly. This happened in very different ways because South Africa is a much more capitalist space than Berlin, particularly, in particular in Germany. I mean, both of them are technically capitalist, but cities in South Africa sort of celebrate capitalism, whereas Berlin is very suspicious of capitalism. And so in South Africa, you had spaces being commodified and privatized very quickly that had been designed to be public spaces under apartheid. They got bought up and turned into gated communities, and everything got commodified, and capitalism ate all the space. So you don't see a lot of public spaces really in South Africa. Berlin went the other direction and claimed all sorts of spaces as third spaces and communal spaces and all sorts of creative anti-capitalist spaces. So you had a very different dynamic. I think in Bogota, I only spent 1 week in Bogota, so I don't have a really rich, deep understanding of the city, but I will say that it's not a repurposed city in that dramatic sense, but it seemed to me when I was there that the mayor at the time was making a very concerted effort to let people have spatial agency over the space in a way that I take it was kind of new for Bogota. So there were, as far as I understand, new rules around street art, for example, and encouraging the production of street art in public spaces. And there was an interest in making the city be more a reflection of the agency of the people who lived in it than had been the case before. But I don't think you saw the sort of dramatic repurposing that you saw in the case of a repurposed city like Berlin or Johannesburg. Or another example of a quickly repurposed city that I didn't get to talk about in my book, but that interests me a lot is Detroit. The car industry collapsed in Detroit, and all of a sudden the city had to become something completely new, which allows a kind of a drama that you don't see in a city like Washington, D.C. or Bogota.
Okay, great, thank you. So, Jose, do you want me to translate the question, or can you?
Sorry, no, I don't need the translation. So, gracias Miguel Ángel por la pregunta, muy buena pregunta, y gracias por los comentarios también que nos hiciste. I wanted to emphasize how beautiful it is to have a multilingual philosophy colloquium. We should have more of that, in which multiple languages are spoken and people can translate back and forth. It's okay if we don't get like 100% of what has been said, but that's fine too. So I love those spaces. But yeah, in answer to your question, Miguel Ángel, so if I had to choose between Austin and Searle, I guess I would go with Austin. But right, but as you can tell from my references, right, the way in which I'm using a speech theory is not so much grounded directly in the Austinian framework or the Searlean framework, but rather in the way in which speech theory has been used in feminist and queer theory, and also in critical race theory. So the people I have quoted are not random people. I mean, they're among the primary, most prominent researchers who have shaped my thought on this, including Ray Lanton, Jennifer Hornsby, Quill Kukla, and Lubel Anderson. I mean, there are many others, Lynn Tyrrell, and many others. It is, in fact, a very exciting time for speech theory, I think, and for philosophy of language in general, because it used to be the case that these discussions were very abstract. And now there are a lot of vibrant applied discussions, applied speech theory, applied discursive analysis. And there are all these vibrant issues that do matter outside academia. That now finally were taken up in philosophy. So I do welcome this way in which we use philosophical tools, including those of speech theory, that are interdisciplinary, that are philosophical, but they are also of relevance, you know, in gender and sexuality studies, in critical race studies, and in other frameworks. So that's the way in which I see my work and the way in which I use applied philosophy of language, and in particular speech theory.
Okay, thank you very much, both of you. And I guess this is the end of our talks, our session today. I'm gonna ask everyone to join me in thanking Jose and Quill, and another round of applause, virtual applause.
Yeah, thank you guys.
Delightful.
Let's see if I can do this. Yeah, there you go. And finally, I want to people, the public, please, if you are fine with that, if you can turn your camera on for a final picture of everyone here. And Chadai, please, if you can help us.
That did not work.
Okay, That's great. So thank you, everyone. And well, have a good day.
Thank you so much, Juan. Nice to see you, Jose.
Very nice to see you, Quill. And thank you, Juan.
Thank you to you. Bye.
Bye.
Adios. Ciao.